On to ultimately prove that the shroud was not a painting, not a scorch, or not a photograph. These were the kind of conventional wisdom things that people had.
For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has been dismissed as a clever medieval sham. But when Barrie Schwortz, a skeptical Jewish photographer, held the latest DNA report in his hands, his 40-year investigation took a terrifying turn. The genetic sequences aren't just from Europe. They point to a global mystery that defies every known historical model. Is this fabric a forgery or a 2,000-year-old miracle? Skeptics claim the case is closed, but the result from dust particles tells a different story. And it all begins with the DNA that shouldn't exist. The DNA that shouldn't exist. In 2015, a scientist named Gianni Barcaccia led a study that changed everything we thought we knew about the Shroud of Turin. Instead of focusing only on the mysterious image of the man on the front of the 14-inch linen, his team decided to look at the dust on the back of it. They used a special vacuum to collect tiny particles of DNA and pollen trapped between the shroud and its protective backing. When they sequenced that DNA, they did not just find traces of people from Europe. They found traces of DNA from people around the world. The results were a total shock to the scientific community because the cloth contained genetic markers from North Africa, the Middle East, and all the way from China. The most puzzling discovery was a heavy presence of DNA from India and South Asia. At first, they thought the traces of this DNA could have been a few stray cells from passing tourists who probably came in contact with the shroud, but the data they got suggested otherwise. One interesting theory that made its way to academic and scientific ears was that the linen itself was manufactured in India, and it didn't seem far-fetched. In ancient times, India was famous for a high-quality fabric called sindan, which sounds almost similar to the Italian word for the shroud, which is sindone. From what they had discovered, it created a sense of tension in the lab that was very confusing. It was so bad that some researchers were actually nervous about signing off on the results. The data was so strange that it threatened the standard academic story. It is hard to explain how DNA from the deep reaches of Asia could end up on a relic that skeptics claim never left Europe. The cloth even carried rare genetic markers linked to the Druze people, a group found specifically in the Levant region near Israel. This was a mystery that had baffled scientists and researchers alike for years. But one man was more than baffled. He was obsessed with figuring out the mysteries surrounding the Shroud of Turin, and this man was Barrie Schwortz. Barrie Schwortz liked to believe the shroud was some sort of biological sponge, and it wasn't exactly untrue. Over many centuries, it traveled through different empires and was handled by thousands of believers, unknowingly capturing a travel log of its own history within its fibers. The presence of these rare genetic lineages from the Middle East and India is almost impossible to explain as a simple accident or a clever hoax. For Schwarz, this DNA evidence is the final nail in the coffin for the idea that the shroud isn't just a medieval painting. It might just hold a story that stretches far beyond the borders of Europe and much deeper into the past than many people want to admit. But to understand why this DNA is so revolutionary, we have to look at the man who spent 40 years trying to prove the shroud was a fake, only to find the opposite. Barrie Schwortz was a professional Hollywood photographer when he got the call of a lifetime. In 1978, he was invited to join a team of elite scientists for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, as it is popularly called. This was the most intense scientific examination ever performed on a single piece of fabric. Scientists from prestigious places like NASA and Los Alamos National Laboratory brought millions of dollars worth of equipment to Italy to solve the mystery once and for all. Barrie was reluctant from the start. As a Jewish man, he had no religious interest in the shroud, being the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. In fact, he was a total skeptic. He joined the team fully believing he would find evidence of paint or brushstrokes within minutes of looking through his lens. He expected to see the clear signs of a medieval artist trying to play a trick on the world. His aim was to simply take the pictures, find the fraud, and go back to his regular life. During those 5 days in Turin, the team worked around the clock. Barrie took thousands of high-resolution, life-sized photographs. These images allowed the team to see the cloth in ways no one ever had before. When they started looking at the photos under microscopes, Barrie hit a wall. He looked for pigments, dyes, or even stains from vapors, but he found absolutely nothing. The image was not made of any known substance. It only existed on the very top layer of the fibers, thinner than a human hair. This was the turning point that changed his life. He realized that no artist in history could have created an image that lacked any physical medium. He went from trying to contest the authenticity of the garment to becoming the world's leading documentarian of its history. He eventually created a website to archive every piece of data for the public to access. He spent decades proving that the shroud is not a painting, even if he still couldn't explain how the image got there in the first place. Through his lens, Schwartz uncovered a hidden image, one where the light and dark are reversed, which was unlike any ordinary painting to ever exist. The mystery of image formation. Back in 1898, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was the first person to take the first official photos of the shroud in the Turin Cathedral. When he looked at the glass plates, he nearly dropped them in shock. He was not looking at a blurry negative plate. Pia saw with his eyes the image of the face of Jesus for the first time in almost 2,000 years. He also discovered that the image on the shroud had a photo-negative quality. For a piece of linen from the Middle Ages to have the properties of film centuries before cameras were invented is a massive scientific puzzle that remains unsolved. When the Sturp team arrived in 1978, they brought millions of dollars in equipment to find the truth. The team included physicists and chemists from top-tier facilities who were used to solving the toughest problems in the world. They expected to find a simple explanation. Instead, the more they tested, the more confused they became. They looked at the fibers under a microscope and found the image was incredibly thin. It only sits on the topmost layer of the linen, specifically the carbohydrate coating. The image never soaked into the fabric or seeped through to the other side. Worst of all, it had no brushstrokes or any sense of direction to the markings. A human artist cannot paint without leaving some kind of trail or pressure, yet this image is perfectly uniform. It resembles a very precise scorch rather than a drawing. The most surprising discovery happened when they put the photos into a VP8 image analyzer. This was a machine used by NASA to map the mountains and craters on the moon. Normally, if you put a standard photograph into this device, the result is a distorted mess. This happens because regular photos are flat and do not contain depth information. However, the shroud produced a perfect three-dimensional image of a human body. This proved the image was created based on the distance between the cloth and the skin, and no other image in the history of art has ever behaved in this manner. After years of testing, the scientists confirmed there were no paints, dyes, or pigments used to create the man on the cloth. They checked for every possible substance, searching for what made the image, and every test came back negative. Some researchers believe the image was caused by a sudden burst of energy, or a corona discharge. This is a type of electrical phenomenon that could have scorched the surface of the fibers in a split second. Whatever the cause, it left a permanent record that modern technology still cannot fully explain or recreate. If the image wasn't painted, then the physical particles found within the cloth, the pollen, and the DNA are the only witnesses left to tell its story. Long before the technology to sequence DNA became a thing, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey decided to treat the shroud like a crime scene. In the 1970s, he used specially designed adhesive tapes to pull microscopic particles from the linen. He wasn't looking for paint or ink like the others. He was more interested in finding evidence to find its origin and location. What Frey found pointed directly to the Middle East. From his discovery, he identified pollen grains from a plant called Gundelia tournefortii. This endemic thorny plant is one that grows almost exclusively in the area around Jerusalem and is not found in the French countryside or the Italian mountains, where the shroud has been kept for centuries. Finding this pollen on the cloth only meant that it had spent a significant amount of time in the Holy Land. The evidence went even deeper than just the location. Scientists looked at the bloom cycles of the various plants found on the fabric. The combination of pollen types indicated that the cloth was exposed to the air in the Jerusalem area during the spring. This lines up perfectly with the time frame of Passover. Frey also found traces of plants from the Anatolian region, which is modern-day Turkey. This supports a long-held theory that the shroud traveled through the Byzantine Empire as a famous relic known as the Image of Edessa before it ever arrived in Europe. Skeptics often try to dismiss these findings by saying that pilgrims visiting the shroud might have carried the pollen on their clothes. However, when researchers looked at the statistical density of the pollen, that theory started to fall apart. The grains were found deep within the fibers, proving the cloth was actually present in those environments. This botanical record perfectly mirrors the new DNA findings we see today. Both the plants and the genetic sequences tell the same story of a journey through the ancient Levant. The pollen proved where the cloth had been, but others still dismissed the validity of the shroud. The carbon-14 controversy. There have been reasons why many theories about the shroud being a fake have been rampant for years, and one particular case is the 1988 carbon-14 test. Back then, 3 world-class laboratories took a small piece of the cloth and announced it was only about 700 years old. They dated it specifically between the years 1260 and 1390. This headline went around the globe, and for many people, the case was closed. However, as time went on, researchers began to notice major red flags in how that test was handled. The main issue was where the sample came from. The labs took a single piece from one of the corners. This specific corner was one of the most handled parts of the entire cloth because people held it there during public displays for centuries. Barrie Schwortz pointed out that his own high-resolution photos showed something strange in that area. He found cotton fibers and even dyes that were not present on any other part of the shroud. This led to a theory called the invisible reweave. This idea points out the fact that medieval nuns repaired a damaged corner of the cloth so perfectly that the scientists in 1988 did not realize they were testing a mix of ancient linen and medieval patches. A chemist named Ray Rogers decided to put this theory to the test. He analyzed the chemical signatures of the sample area and compared them to the rest of the shroud. He found that they were fundamentally different. One of his most famous tests looked for a substance called vanillin. This is a chemical found in linen that slowly disappears as the fabric ages. The main body of the shroud had 0 vanillin left, proving it had to have been between 1,300 and 3,000 years old. However, the 1988 sample still contained vanillin, proving it was much younger than the rest of the cloth. Even the math behind the original test has been called into question. Modern statisticians who looked at the raw data from 1988 found that the results from the 3 labs did not actually match up. They called the data non-homogeneous, which is just a way of saying the test was scientifically invalid because of all the inconsistencies. If the carbon-14 test was wrong and the DNA says the cloth is ancient, then we must look at the most gruesome evidence of all, the blood. For a long time, critics argued that the red stains on the shroud were simply paint or pig's blood used by a clever artist. However, when the STURP team analyzed the samples, they found something far more disturbing. The stains on the cloth were real human blood stains, specifically type AB. This blood type is relatively rare worldwide, but is found more in populations from the Middle East. You might wonder why the blood is still red after all these centuries. Usually, old blood turns brown or black as it ages. The scientists found high levels of a chemical called bilirubin in the stain. This happens when a human body goes through extreme physical trauma or intense torture. The liver releases this chemical into the bloodstream, and it acts as a preservative that keeps the blood looking red for a very long time. The blood patterns do not just show random marks. From the patterns, they show a precise map of a Roman crucifixion. There are puncture wounds around the head that look like they came from a crown of thorns, and large wounds in the side that match the shape of a Roman spear. Most importantly, the stains show serum separation, which occurs when the blood starts to separate into red cells and a clear liquid after death. This is a forensic detail that no medieval painter would have known about. While researchers found DNA in these stains, Getting a clear sequence is the difficult part. The genetic code is degraded and mixed with the newer DNA from people who handled the cloth over the centuries. Still, the patterns tell the story of a specific person who suffered a specific event. This isn't just a generic cloth, but a forensic record that matches only one event and person in history. The invisible weave and the India connection. Taking a closer look at the fabric itself, the fabric of the shroud doesn't look like it came from any cheap garment because it has a 3-to-1 herringbone twill weave. This feature can only be found in a high-end textile in the ancient world and is the kind of luxury item only a wealthy person could afford. This detail fits the historical accounts perfectly, as someone like Joseph of Arimathea would have had the means to buy such fine linen for a burial. The DNA findings from India actually strengthen this connection. In the 1st century, the finest linens often came from the East. Finding Indian genetic markers on the fibers suggests this cloth was a high-quality import. Textile experts have compared the shroud to fragments found at Masada, which date back to the 1st century, and the similarities are striking. Even the physical dimensions of the cloth match up with ancient cubit measurements used in the Levant 2,000 years ago. Barrie Schwortz often points out that the sheer quality of the weave is the reason it survived so much wear and tear over the centuries. It was built to last, yet the mystery remains. The DNA and the weave place the cloth in the right place and time, but how did it get from a tomb in Jerusalem to a cathedral in Italy? For a long time, there was a massive gap in the shroud's history. However, the 2015 DNA study might have found the trail. Historians believe the shroud spent centuries in the Byzantine Empire, known as the Image of Edessa. Back then, it was likely folded in a frame to show only the face. After the siege of Constantinople in 1204, it vanished. This is where the Knights Templar enter the story. Many believe this secret order held the cloth in private for years before it finally resurfaced in France in 1354. The genetic footprints found in the dust support this exact path. The researchers found North African and Anatolian DNA, which perfectly matches the route from Jerusalem through Turkey and into Europe. Even after the famous fire of 1532 that nearly destroyed the cloth, the DNA evidence remained trapped in the fibers. Barrie Schwortz used this blend of science and history to bridge the gaps that once baffled researchers. Every new piece of data, from the DNA to the history, points toward authenticity. So why is science still so divided? The science of faith. The truth is that science has reached a limit, especially knowing researchers have spent decades proving what the shroud is not. We know it is not a painting, a photograph, or a clever medieval scourge. Yet science struggles to explain exactly what it is. This brings us to the supernatural gap. Many people look at the evidence and see a snapshot of a physical transformation, an event that released a massive burst of energy to create the image. Because science cannot test for miracles, it remains stuck at the finish line. Barrie Schwortz has a unique philosophy on this. He believes the shroud was left behind on purpose as a witness for a future age, a time when our technology would be advanced enough to read its secrets. We have to distinguish between legal evidence and scientific proof. In a court of law, the DNA, the blood, and the pollen would be enough to win a case. In the lab, however, scientists are often hesitant. The religious implications are so heavy that some experts refuse to accept the data because it challenges their worldview. But new tools are coming to test the shroud much more accurately than the flawed 1988 test ever did. The DNA legacy is now part of that pile of evidence. Finding genetic markers from India and China proves that this cloth has been on a global journey. It is a biological record of a relic that was venerated by people from all over the world long before the medieval period. Schwartz gives a final warning to anyone looking into what the Shroud of Turin could be. He advises that researchers should not be blind to single tests from 40 years ago against the massive amount of evidence that exists today. The mystery draws in people of all faiths, and even those with no faith at all. We have the best technology in human history, yet we still cannot recreate this image. Whether you believe it is the burial cloth of Jesus or the world's most sophisticated mystery, the evidence is undeniable. Do you think the DNA evidence finally proves the shroud's origin? Let us know in the comments. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching.